is it? How do we get there? Continues with Barbara Walters.
Our journey to heaven takes a bit of a detour now as we veer off into some very provocative territory, the land of science and skeptics. Scientists say they're beginning to understand why so many people believe in heaven, but they've yet to come up with the proof that it exists. Until they do, believers will still have to make that leap of faith, while non-believers will no doubt keep their feet planted firmly on the ground.
This is the first camp in the history of the United States for the children of the irreligious, by whatever.
It is the atheist answer to Bible camp.
Critical thinking, observing things.
Camp Quest is devoted to teaching kids not to accept religious beliefs like the belief in heaven on faith alone.
Children can go there and feel comfortable about not believing in a God, not being religious. It's a good thing.
My mother worked in a church because
Ellen Johnson is a former president of the American Atheists, a group that does not believe there is life after death. Do you feel that religion is essentially superstition?
Religion is all superstition.
Let me just ask you directly, does heaven exist?
No. Heaven doesn't exist. Hell doesn't exist. We weren't alive before we were born, and we're not going to exist after we die.
Isn't it depressing not to believe in heaven?
I'm not happy about the fact that that's the end of life, but I can accept that and make my life more fulfilling now because this is the only chance I have.
Why do most people believe in heaven?
It really is quite alluring to think that you are going to be reunited with loved ones and live in a blissful place without a care in the world. But if we really thought we were going to be reunited with deceased children and parents, we wouldn't be so resistant at the end.
You're saying if heaven is really a wonderful place, we should all be
hanging ourselves now.
You can't prove that there's a God in heaven, but you also can't prove that there isn't.
Right. But the burden of proof is always on the person who posits the belief. Okay, so if you posit the idea that there is, you know, a green man outside the door, you have to prove it.
But for most people, proof of heaven's existence is not necessary. Faith is all they need. Dr. Dean Hamer, a former geneticist at the National Institutes of Health, thinks he has figured out why this faith comes easily to some, but eludes others.
Whether a person is spiritual or not is not necessarily a matter of their will. It may be something innate about their personality.
Hamer wondered if atheists, or anyone else, have a choice to believe or not to believe. His research began with a questionnaire to over 1,000 people.
It asks questions like, do you sometimes feel connected to other parts of the universe? Or do you believe in miracles? And we found that everybody has some level of spirituality, but some people are simply higher on that scale.
But why? Hamer suspected spirituality might be a personality trait encoded in our genes. He tested the DNA from the study's participants and found that those who scored highest had a mutation of at least one gene that seemed to affect their level of spirituality. He named it the God gene.
It's a gene, it's called VMAT2, and we can isolate it and we can study it in detail.
What does this gene give to a person that affects their spirituality?
This particular gene controls certain chemicals in the brain, and those chemicals affect how consciousness works. They affect the way that our feelings react to the events around us.
Are there changes in the brain if you pray?
Several researchers have now performed sophisticated brain scans of people undergoing intense prayer, and they can sense very small but important changes in brain chemistry.
Dr. Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist at Thomas Jefferson University, is one of those researchers. He studied nuns deep in prayer and Buddhist meditators lost in their trance-like states.
Sometimes people have this incredible sense of blissfulness and calmness. We might have an experience where we become one with God, become one with the universe.
Using brain imaging technology, Newberg was actually able to observe measurable changes in his test subjects' brains.
During the meditation practice, there's been a significant increase in the activity across that frontal part of the brain. So we see much more red here and here than what we saw here and here. And this is activated whenever we focus our attention on something.
At the same time, the parts of the brain that monitor our sense of time and space became less active.
And then they begin to have that losing of their sense of self. And it's attributed to God, for example. And then they feel that God is providing them that energy, that feeling.
But perhaps your depth of spiritual feeling still comes down to your God gene. If indeed there is a gene that contributes to spirituality, what does this say?
It says that nature has given us a capacity to be spiritual. Otherwise, the gene would have not survived evolution. It also tells us that spirituality may be simpler or more difficult for some people.
When you talk to people who you thought had this gene, did more of them believe in God?
They didn't necessarily believe more in God, but they did have more belief in something.
Does having this gene contribute to a belief in heaven?
I think that having the gene probably does contribute to believing in an afterlife.
Instead of a God gene, you could call it a heaven gene.
You could call it a heaven gene or a nirvana gene or a belief that there's something else out there gene.
Even as we explore the cosmos to see what else is out there, it seems we still need spirituality to make our experiences complete. The astronauts of Apollo 8 were so inspired by their heavenly view of Earth that they quoted Genesis.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And God made the firmament. And God called the firmament heaven.
When we come back, a trip to heaven while they were still on Earth.
I was flatlined. There wasn't a pulse. I was dead.
Deb, do you think that you were in heaven?
I saw a glimpse of heaven.
But this doctor says seeing isn't believing.
I would interpret it as a hallucination.